On the Zoom. Okay, we have to try and remember that. So good evening, everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this joint meeting that we have today. And it's very, very nice to see our numbers slowly increasing. I think this is live lecture number 4 or something like that. So gradually people are taking the courage and coming and seeing us. So tonight, it's a real pleasure to welcome Michael Cottakis, who is here tonight to talk to us about the port cities and various entrepreneurial sort of visions to do with Smyrna and Salonika. So, and he's currently doing his PhD at the LSE, but I think you were at Royal Holloway, you did classics at Royal Holloway, so some time ago. And so it's really great delight to welcome you, and I'm going to hand over to you.
Yes,
all right,
absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's an enormous pleasure to be with you here this evening. Thank you very much, Alison, for the introduction. Thank you very much to the Royal Asiatic Society and to the Levantine Heritage Foundation for inviting me to be here today. And thank you all for making it through the grim, cold, bitter cold, I should say, very un-Levantine-like weather to make it here today and attend this lecture. And indeed, many colleagues of mine at the LSE and at the think tank that I run, the 89 Initiative, often teasingly remark that I have chosen my geographical area of focus purely for the lifestyle benefits that it involves. And I do admit there are significant advantages to studying Salonika and Smyrna, not least the food and the lovely climate. But I do assure you, ladies and gentlemen, that my interest in these subjects is not superficial. I think that the case for these cities is a highly prescient one in our time. I think understanding these cities is very important, particularly as we are now living in a world of increasing nationalism, sort of authoritarian revanche, we can call it, and many international centres, not least our own here in London, are under threat. And my talk today also seeks to make the case, more general case, for cities themselves, those great juggernauts of commercial and human activity that I believe are more important and more enduring than states in the history of civilization. And I do want to show that while great cities may decline, they may remain dormant across time, very often they retain the core ingredients that has brought them success in the past. And if those ingredients can be fused with more propitious conditions, those cities may re-emerge again over time. This process doesn't happen instantly. It's a long-term process, but it can happen. So why these two cities? Why are we talking about Smyrna and Salonika today? So Salonika and Smyrna were two of the grand old ladies of the late Ottoman Near East, two of several port cities bejeweling the Eastern Mediterranean, forming this physical and metaphorical bridge between the worlds of the Levant, where the sun rises, and the worlds of the Western colonial powers on the fringes of the Eurasian subcontinent. And of course, the word port derives from the Latin word portus, which means a contact point or an interface. And these were port cities in the true Latinate meaning of the term. Not only were they points of entry and exit, but importantly, they were also melting pots. They were forests of ethnic, cultural, and religious hybridity. And they were touch papers for the spread of modern ideas. And there were Ottoman cities, there were Aegean cities, with all the maladies and the advantages that this involved. And there were sister cities in very many ways, the connections between them informing one another's strength and dynamism. And it's the subject of little doubt that cities such as Smyrna and Salonika, but other port cities in the Levant, Constantinople, Alexandria, and Aleppo. I mean, Aleppo is a fantastic example. It's not a maritime city in the traditional sense, but it is a port city in the original Latinate meaning of the term, a melting pot, an emporium. And these cities formed springs of near unique cultural and commercial dynamism. In contrast that had poorer relations inland. They were known for their distinctive entrepreneurial ethos, which is an ethos found in an understanding of the sea as a kind of switchboard of commercial connectivity and opportunity, an aquatic highway linking the parochial with the modern, the local with the global. And their inhabitants traded figs, they traded raisins, textiles, tobacco, cottons, carpets, spices, you name it. They also bartered less savory items, those opioid staples of Europe's seedier tea houses and literary societies. And if any members of the audience this evening have read The Mystery of Edwin Drood, the novels of Henry James, then you will be well aware of the impact such substances had on the creative dynamic of the salons of Paris and London in the late 19th century. So virtuous or otherwise, these cities are of interest to economic historians and more generally to historians. Ottoman censuses demonstrate the presence of a higher proportion of entrepreneurs in late Ottoman Salonika and Smyrna than in London or Glasgow at the same time, two cities, of course, at the height of their own commercial boom. And their global trade connections, it's safe to say, far exceeded anything else in the Ottoman Empire. Together, they accounted for almost 60% of total Ottoman exports. That's an enormous figure for two cities alone, when you consider that Constantinople, the capital city, is not included in that. And in this sense, it's quite plausible to talk of them as a sort of Hong Kong and Singapore of their day. And yet, in the 20th century, Smyrna and Salonika dramatically changed. They lost their crucial position in the east-west trade. They declined into mere regional relevance. They experienced consummate demographic upheavals, eradicating an ageless cosmopolitan culture and dynamic. And from the ashes of this trauma, Ottoman Salonika was reborn as Greek Thessaloniki. Smyrna became Turkish Izmir. Fabled businesses departed with their founders, commercial networks shriveled. These cities, it seemed, had forever lost their unique character. And for decades, commentators lamented this kind of waning of a glorious Levantine sun. For many today, these are cities of ghosts, their paradise lost. And whilst I want to show how these cities were changed by their encounters, particularly with nationalism, the main point of my lecture today is to challenge the assumption of irrevocable rupture. This idea that somehow the city's ageless tradition was lost forever into the historical ether. And what I aim to do particularly is to chart elements of the past that live on today, both in physical terms, but also in the hearts and minds of ordinary citizens. And there are 5 elements in particular that I want to talk about today. And these are entrepreneurialism, and Alison, you alluded to entrepreneurialism. So entrepreneurialism is one element of continuity. Trade, and I'll tell you what I mean by trade later, not international trade in the way that the cities operated previously, but trade as a kind of identity. Identity more broadly is the third, conflict with the capital city, the fourth, and the activism of local mayors, the fifth. And by looking at these elements together, it's possible to see how the past gives life and meaning to the present, how it informs collective identities and behaviors, and how it lays, hopefully, fertile ground for the future. And what is so interesting about Salonika and Smyrna, ladies and gentlemen, is that these cities, with these processes that I'm going to discuss, are almost identical in many ways. Obviously, there are differences, and we can discuss those later on, but in these areas, at least, they demonstrate a lot of similarity. And that's something which renders applicable, perhaps, parts of their stories to other cities. So let's first take a look at what the cities were like in their late Ottoman height, and then we will move on to discuss elements of continuity and change. I'm trying to get the PowerPoint to change slide. I think I'm doing something wrong.
No, I don't think you are. Sometimes it sticks.
I saw it very, very briefly. It flickered. Yeah, I'm back. Brilliant. That's it.
Was that? Oh,
that's it.
There we go.
So I just press this.
Well, hopefully it will.
Fantastic. Right. Okay, so this is Salonika. These photos that I'm going to show you now were taken in around between 1912 and 1915, so around the time that the city was being assimilated into the Greek state. And I think the way you can you most easily distinguish different denominations in Salonika is by their diverse head apparel and some general attire. And so here I think you can quite clearly see some Greeks, but I think very important to say about the Greeks of Salonika, they were not the majority in Salonika in 1912. In fact, they formed an important but small minority. 21% of the population in 1912, when the city was taken by the Greeks, was Greek. So it was not a Greek city. So we challenge that assumption there. It's very important to say that. I'm trying to change the slide again, and it's got stuck. That's all right. No, it's absolutely fine. It's
you have to use them.
okay, I'm happy to do that. Okay, all right.
Just tiny.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so these are Turks who were a slightly larger group within late Ottoman Salonika, around 22% as well. These are poorer Turks. The city also had a very wealthy Turkish merchant community. Of course, Mustafa Kemal Pasha, later Ataturk, was born in Salonika in the 1870s and formed part of that wealthier merchant community. These are less well-off Turks. You can identify them obviously by their turbans and the veils. This is in the Salonika Kapan, the marketplace in central Salonika, to the side, sort of in the recesses of the market. That's all right. I'll try and get it.
Okay. Sorry about
that's all right. No, that's fine. You seem to have the magic touch.
Well,
that's
don't speak to
that's fine.
Come back.
All right. So we've seen the Greeks and the Turks and the Muslims. These are the Jews, and the Jews were the most important community in late Ottoman Salonika. You can identify the Jews by their sort of deeper fezzes and more elaborate attire. They're Sephardi Jews, these particular ones, Orthodox Jews as well. And it's interesting that the Jews formed around 58% of the population of Salonika at the time. To all intents and purposes, Salonika was a Jewish city and had been a Jewish city ever since the arrival of the Sephardi Jews in the early 1500s. It seems to be, it has a sort of thing against me, this particular. Right.
Stand here.
You're going to, just in case. You never know. Hopefully, it will start to like me a bit more as it gets used to me. So of all the groups, it was the Sephardi Jews who dominated life in Ottoman Salonika. I should just say, when I say it's a Jewish city, I don't mean it's an only Jewish city. It was not a Jewish city in the sense that Tel Aviv is a Jewish city, but it was a majority Jewish city in terms of population. And it was also a Jewish city in the sense that Jews dominated the commerce of the city. And most, as I said, had arrived in the 1500s, and they'd instantly turned Salonika into the largest Jewish city on earth. And it remained the largest Jewish city on earth well into the 19th century when it was overtaken by London. In fact, it remained the only majority Jewish city in the world until the 1930s when it was overtaken by Jerusalem. And in that sense, it was very much the mother of Israel, as it was called by its Jewish inhabitants, and the Jerusalem of the Balkans. And the Sephardi Jews retained their original dialect of Ladino, which is a kind of Spanish dialect drawn from the 15th century. It's very similar to 15th century Spain. So it's kind of like a cross-section of 15th century Spanish society and language transplanted into the Levant and remaining there for centuries. And this here, what you see here is a textile factory. It was started by Moshe Alatini, a very successful Jewish entrepreneur in the 19th century. The Alatinis built a textile empire across the Ottoman Empire, and this was their sort of home base in Salonika. They employed thousands of locals, Jews, Greeks, Armenians, and others. And what's very interesting, something which shows the dominance of the Jews in a commercial sense in the city, is that a list of the 50 wealthiest families in Salonika in the late 19th century. In that list, 40 were Jewish, which is more than the 58% as a kind of proportion. So they were extremely commercial, very entrepreneurial. And there are other members beyond the Alatinis. There are other members of the Ottoman Salonika Jewish rich list that may be well known to an audience in the UK. Change the slide. Wonderful, fantastic. So members of the audience may know names such as Sarkozy, Sassoon of hairstyling fame, Vidal Sassoon, and anyone who knows France well in the audience will know the Dassault family. The Dassault family was connected to the Alatini family, and Dassault, of course, a big multinational aerospace firm in France. This image here shows Isaac Carrasso, who was a Jew born in Salonika in the late 19th century. He established the Danone group. And I'm sure you all know Danone today is one of the great multinational food companies. I should say that Isaac Carrasso did not establish Danone in Salonika. He had emigrated, he had left the city. In fact, the first Danone factory was in Barcelona, but he did sell yogurt on the streets of Salonika in his youth. So perhaps some of his inspiration was drawn from, or a lot of his inspiration was drawn from the city. I'm going to try and be very brave and try and do this myself. Yeah, it doesn't work. Yes, fantastic. I'm getting the hang of it. This is looking a lot more promising, my friends. Fantastic. So if the Jews were the dominant force in Salonika, it was the Greeks who had emerged, both in population terms and increasingly in the 19th century in commercial terms, as the dominant players, major players, I should say, in Smyrna. And Smyrna is an interesting case in terms of population. So the Greeks were roughly half the population of Smyrna. Smyrna was a larger city than Salonika, about double in size. It was a population of about 300,000, very large city by late 19th century standards. About half the population at the turn of the century was Greek, and the Turks, much like the Greeks were the minority in Salonika, the Turks were the minority in Smyrna. But there were others in Smyrna. It was a very international city. There were Arabs, there were Armenians, we were talking about this with Craig earlier, there were even a few Russians at some point, very small number, but it was a very international city. But the strength of the Greeks derives from their command of the networks, Greek networks in the rich agricultural hinterland of Smyrna, which produced a lot of its commodities that were exported through the Mediterranean. And in this synthesis, producers were very often Greek. The exporters of the commodities were themselves very often Greek, and all too often, increasingly, given the Greek diaspora, the importers on the other end tended to be Greek. So there's a big Greek cartel with Smyrna at its hub. And this here is an image of Frank Street. I think I should just plug the Levantine Heritage Foundation. I got some of these photos, and this is one of them from the Levantine Heritage Foundation website, which is a fantastic website. And there are some truly astonishing photographs. And so this is one, and it's a colorized photograph of Frank Street. Frank Street was the main commercial artery of Ottoman Smyrna, and it was called Frank Street because of the influence in the city of a small but very influential group of Western European emigres who were called Franks, or later Levantines in modern parlance. And they had moved en masse to Smyrna in the late sort of 17th century onwards and had set up commercial enterprises and become extremely wealthy in so doing. And they helped put Smyrna onto the international financial map. Essentially what they did is they provided access to European capital networks and markets, and they plugged, as I say, Smyrna into the sort of financial and logistical supergrid of the late imperial world order. So without the Levantines, Smyrna could not have been the emporium that it was, even if the Greeks were, in terms of numbers and in terms of their commercial activities, proportionately more important. And by the 1910s, when this photograph was taken, many of the Levantines had concentrated in the Buja region of Smyrna towards the north. They called it paradise because of the gentle waters and lovely airs. And they had accumulated titles, wealth, and a very, very interesting culture. So I encourage you, if you're I'm preaching to the converted, I think, here. But if you are interested to learn more about the Levantines as people and as a culture, again, the Levantine Heritage Foundation, I'm sure, will provide huge amounts of resources. Now, let me try and shift the slide again. Wrong way. It keeps on going backwards. No, that's yes, fantastic, fantastic. I will get there, and I'm very sorry. It's clearly the shape of my thumb is not very helpful. So this is a photo of the main factory of the Oriental carpet manufacturers, and the Oriental carpet manufacturers, the OCM in Smyrna, held a near monopoly over the export distribution of carpets from the Ottoman Empire. 95%, a whopping 95% of all carpets made in the Ottoman Empire were exported rather from the Ottoman Empire, were exported by the OCM, which had branches in London, had branches in Paris, New York. It was a real multinational conglomerate, a very powerful organization. It was a Levantine firm, it was not a Greek firm, and its leadership was Levantine. But given the commercial interaction that took place across the ethnic constellation of Smyrna, not all of its partners were Western Europeans in origin. There are Armenians involved, Jews particularly. The Greeks were quite jealous of this organization, given its success. And so the OCM was part of a bigger story of entrepreneurialism in late Ottoman Smyrna. The 1909 census, it was a late Ottoman industrial census, shows that there was a high number of per capita joint stock companies, anonim şirketi, the word in Turkish, anonymous societies, as they were called, in Salonika and Smyrna than anywhere else in the Ottoman Empire at the time. Constantinople, which was a port city as well as a port city, as I alluded to earlier, was unable to match either in terms of the sheer dynamism of trade and entrepreneurship, and was consequently left to stew, often jealously, in the shade of both cities, at least in an economic sense. But like many great cosmopolitan centers, cities such as London, Hong Kong, Dubai today, Salonika and Smyrna were increasingly vulnerable to the forces of authoritarian, I should say, nationalism. Yes? So this here, ladies and gentlemen, is an image of the Greek army entering Salonika on the 26th of October, 1912. And this followed victory over the Ottoman Empire in the First Balkan War. This is a great colorized photo. And much though sort of later accounts of this event imagine sort of streets festooned with Greek flags. This is a real photograph, and you can see there's not one Greek flag, because of course this was not a Greek city, I should emphasize. And this really was the beginning of the end for Ottoman and cosmopolitan Salonika. And it would take a while for the city to be sort of de-Ottomanized, if you like, because of course the Jews who had formed such an important part of Ottoman Salonika remained in situ, many of them, up until the tragic events of the Holocaust. But by the arrival of the Greek army, there was a path dependency, there was a direction of travel, and the city was, what was in store for the city was a kind of diet of Hellenism and the removal of trade-friendly institutions. And it was, yes, a sad moment in some ways. In other ways, for many Greeks, of course, a very happy moment, and we should emphasize that as well. And if the process took longer in Salonika and Smyrna, the process of de-Ottomanization or de-cosmopolitanization occurred really in one bloody fell swoop. And this is a picture of the Great Fire of Smyrna of 1922, a fire, of course, which followed the capture of the city by the forces of Mustafa Kemal, that famous son, of course, of Salonika that we mentioned. It followed the war in Anatolia, fought between the Greek armies intent on establishing a Greek empire in Western Anatolia, with Smyrna at its heart, and the forces of the Turkish resistance led by Kemal and İnönü. And of course, the forces of the Greeks were defeated. The Turks came roaring in, and we don't know how the fire started. It's much debated how it started. Greeks say Turks started it. Turks say Greeks or Armenians started it. Armenians say they weren't involved. But what's for certain is that the Armenian quarter was the source of the fire. So you can see there in the north of the city, enormous plume of smoke and ash emanating from the Armenian quarter, and it consumed the city. It utterly destroyed the kind of core of Ottoman Smyrna. And what you see there is the cordon, the waterfront, and the cordon just about survived, but everything behind it was destroyed. The European quarter was destroyed. Frank Street and the environs around Frank Street were laid waste, and the city was essentially burnt to a cinder, very little of the Ottoman city surviving. And in the aftermath of the Greco-Turkish War came the Treaty of Lausanne, and this created modern Turkey as a country. It also legally ended the Ottoman Empire, and it rubber-stamped this grim process of population exchange between Greece and Turkey that saw 1.5 million Anatolian Christians forcibly removed from their homes and moved to Greece. And the other way came roughly 500,000 Greek Muslims, Turks, depending on how you want to look at it, from Crete and Macedonia, newly acquired territories by the Greek government. And through this process, you can see the look of horror on many of these individuals' faces. They've been uprooted and taken away from their homes to lands where very often they couldn't even speak the language. And, many of these people, these are Anatolian Greeks. You can see there the flag of the American Red Cross, could not speak Greek, many of them. And many Greek Muslims, of course, could not speak Turkish. But through this process, Smyrna was purged of anyone Greek, and many others started to leave in droves. And Salonika, of course, lost its sizable Muslim population, which still in 1922-23 was around 20,000 people. And both cities filled with refugees, and these refugees were gradually assimilated. They learnt the language, they became Greeks and Turks, respectively, and the hybridity of these cities that had characterized the late Ottoman period was substituted for a new ethnic and religious uniformity. That was something entirely new in the history of both of these cities. Oh dear, now it's going the other way. No, I've got it. Oh, now this is working. Fantastic. All right, that's all right. So with their incorporation into nation states, the cities became subject to new restrictive national institutions. And these replaced the weaker but decentralized Ottoman institutions that in their dying days had allowed trade and capital to flow largely unfettered in port cities of the empire like Salonika and Smyrna. And here you see two pictures. On the far side, you see the family of the Dutch consul, who had a hereditary consulship, Edmond de Hoogpied, and then on the right side, you see the final valley of Smyrna, the last valley of Smyrna, Rahmi Bey, a benevolent valley, very important in the history of late and important the success of late Ottoman Smyrna. And the main responsibility of consuls like de Hoogpied was to enforce the capitulations, which were commercial agreements signed between the Ottoman Empire and Western powers, which essentially allowed Western powers the right to operate merchants under their own domestic rules in the Ottoman Empire. So French merchants could trade with the Ottoman Empire using French rules, British using British rules, and Dutch using Dutch rules. So consuls like de Hoogpied, whose name I always pronounce differently. I call him de Hoogpied or de Hoogpied. Some may have the correct pronunciation, could perhaps enlighten me later on, but consuls like de Hoogpied would saunter around town and essentially act as kind of gatekeepers for the capitulations, and they could apply rather brutal retribution in the case of infringement. Of course, upon the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the capitulations were discontinued. and the free trade, international trade rather, that the capitulations allowed ended rather swiftly. Greece and Turkey pivoted to new national policies which were not particularly friendly to port cities, policies such as import substitution, agricultural autarky, which of course I'm not going to go into in any great depth, but what they did was serve to limit the export potential of port cities. And of course, port cities existed to export and to import, I mean this in trade terms only, and this was very much the detriment of them. And of course, the new regimes also permitted very little scope for local urban autonomy of the sort experienced earlier. So Rahmi Bey, I mentioned the last valley of Smyrna, had quite extraordinary influence in the city. He also had some rather significant powers. He had tax collecting powers, which is something that mayors today would give their front teeth for, I can assure you. And that also meant, of course, that valleys such as Rahmi could defy Constantinople, the capital city, different occasions. So Rahmi, who was a benevolent valley, used his clout in a different way. He sought to protect Armenians during the period of 1913 to 1915 from the sort of rather negatively intent, let's say, young Turkish government during the First World War. But again, following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the autonomous and powerful valley was replaced by the figure of the elected mayor, who of course had a very different personality and infinitely less potential to shape events. And I think against this backdrop, it's important to say a little bit about the links between the two cities. And how these declined at the end of the Ottoman Empire. So during the Ottoman period, there were daily maritime connections between Salonika and Smyrna. And as I said, the cities really relied on one another in many ways for connecting the kind of Near East and Balkan routes in particular. And so that line linking Salonika and Smyrna diagonally across the Aegean, you'd have merchants chugging their wares up and down the Aegean on a daily basis. And of course, with the arrival of the Greek army and the excision of Salonika and Macedonia from the internal market of the Ottoman Empire, this began to be very limited. And by the 1920s, there were almost no trade connections between the two cities at all. So between 1912 and 1923, Salonika and Smyrna were transformed. They were transformed from cornucopias of different languages, ethnicities, and religions into great behemoths of cultural and ethnic homogeneity. They were physically destroyed. The vestments of their late Ottoman pasts swiftly eradicated by voracious Greek and Turkish state builders. They were also destroyed in an institutional sense. They were cleaved apart from those favorable to trade Ottoman institutions that had facilitated their success in the 19th century. They were squeezed into the regulatory straitjacket of the Greek and Turkish nation state. So in every imaginable form, at least it seems, that Salonika and Smyrna were driven from their formerly glorious pasts and seemed set for more paltry futures as second-rate players on the international stage, say relegated from a kind of urban Premier League. And while clearly it's difficult to contest that in global importance, the two cities, say Thessaloniki and Izmir, failed to match Salonika and Smyrna, there are significant areas, nonetheless, of continuity that paint a more nuanced picture to the one of irrevocable rupture that's often paraded by historians. So the source of this particular narrative has long held that the Greek community and the Turkish community of Salonika and Smyrna, respectively, simply greeted their conquerors with open arms and said, right, let's shed our cosmopolitan past. We're fine with this. We don't mind at all. And this, ladies and gentlemen, was clearly not the case. There was very great ambivalence about the nation state amongst Greek merchants in Salonika and Turkish merchants in Smyrna. And this here This image here is of Cleon Papalazarou and his sort of coterie of employees at an earlier stage in his career. So by the time that the city was captured by the Greek army, Cleon was a little bit older. This is him in a younger stage. You can see him there by his voluminous moustache, and these are his colleagues. He was the chairman of the Banque de Salonique, first Greek chairman of the Banque de Salonique, and was also the first Greek chairman of the Ottoman Chamber of Commerce in Salonika. And Cleon Papalazarou was one of many Greeks that backed the idea of turning Salonika into an international free port. He had looked at cities like Trieste and others where this had been tried, and in East Asia, cities like Hong Kong, where this had been tried, and thought, this is a great idea. It's a sort of best of both worlds, having your cake and eating it, as the Prime Minister might like to say. And this was, funny enough, quite a dominant view amongst Greek merchants in Salonika at the time. They favored the idea of the free port. They liked it because it meant that Salonika could essentially self-regulate its commerce and trade relations, whilst being nominally, at least, sovereign territory of the Greek state. But perhaps unsurprisingly, the idea was vehemently opposed by nationalists, in particular a smaller caucus of nationalist business people in Salonika, who organized around the Nealeski, or the New Club, as it was called, sort of competitor organization to the Chamber of Commerce, and advocated for the immediate unification of Salonika with Greece in customs terms, so customs union with Greece. And it really is worth emphasizing at this point that the most prominent merchants in the city did not want customs unification with Greece, at least not immediately. Perhaps they wanted a roadmap towards customs unification. They did not want instant customs unification for the simple reason that it would spell disaster in economic terms for their city, which had been Balkan-facing, international, and if it was, as I say, contained within this regulatory cage of the Greek state and within hard borders that cut it off from its Balkan hinterland, it could be quite seriously impoverished. So they feared this sort of future of parochialism and this idea that the melting pot of Salonika would end up just playing second fiddle to Athens. And so the merchants in favor of the international free port argued in economic and rational terms, and then the others argued in emotional and national terms. And of course, as in most arguments that pit the emotional with the rational, also we've seen this with Brexit, although some will say Brexit is rational. I'm sitting on the fence in this particular instance. The emotional argument ended up winning. So Papalazarou and his ilk were ultimately consumed in a kind of nationalist storm. Eleftherios Venizelos came down, a minister of Greece at the time, came down on the side of the new club, the Nealeski, and basically said, sorry guys, no international free port, it's customs union or bust, essentially. And this is a picture of a Turkish family. And on the right, you can see the figures of Latife Hanum and Muammer Bey, who is part of the Uşaklıoğlu clan of Turkish super merchants living in Smyrna. And the eagle-eyed amongst you will have noticed the figure standing second from the left. That is Jamal Ataturk. And this photo is taken around 1923, so after the capture of Smyrna by the Ottoman armies and the establishment of the Turkish Republic, the Turkish nation state. And Latife Hanum was the wife of Jamal Ataturk. But little is known of the feelings of the Uşaklıoğlu clan regarding the destruction of Smyrna. It's very interesting. They were obviously steeped in the culture of Smyrna. They'd grown up in a cosmopolitan environment. Uşaklıoğlu Muammer Bey and his ancestors had made a lot of money living in the old way. So it's very interesting to think what they felt about this new turn. And some historians have suggested that they were concerned and that they sought assurances from Kemal that the city would continue to operate on international lines as it had done previously, and at least that the Republic would adopt export-friendly policies. And assurances were duly offered. But in the event that promises were not kept, tensions are rumoured to have risen in the Ataturk or Kemal Uşaklıoğlu family. And in this respect, it is worth noting that the present-day Uşaklıoğlu family has not wanted the memoirs of Latife to be published. And they say that there could be rather sensitive information. And they talk about possible disagreements between Kemal and Latife over the direction that Turkey would end up taking. And what's very interesting is that the Economic Congress, the first Economic Congress of Turkey, took place in Izmir in 1923. And it's quite pertinent that it took place in Izmir, because Izmir was very much seen as the most important, at the time, most important economic centre of Turkey. And it was a hotly contested affair. It's worth saying. There were two groups, some that wanted a sort of liberal free trading vision. That was sort of the Smyrna clan of business people wanted a sort of much more liberal and export-friendly vision. And then there were others who had fought nobly for the Turkish cause, who wanted a kind of more statist approach where they would get some of the benefits. And they did not like the rich Smyrna Turks kind of having all the pieces of the pie. And whatever you might think, for the first 10 years of the Republic, at least, it seemed like the Smyrna vision for Turkey's economic future was winning out. The policies were export-oriented. They were relatively liberal. Of course, however, the 1929 Wall Street crash changed things, and Turkey rather quickly adopted a statist approach. But I do think it's worth mentioning that in the history of modern Turkey since then, this Smyrna vision has always been part of the public consciousness. It's had some purchase of elements of the society at different stages. It's been tapped into. Think about the reforms of Turgut Özal, for example, in the 1980s, very liberal reforms, talking a lot about the trading cosmopolitan past in justifying those reforms. So I think the assumption that these cities were somehow in thrall to the nationalist Pied Piper is a fundamentally wrong one. I wanted to say that at the outset. It's an important part of the story. And while it is right to say that the cities declined entirely as cosmopolitan centres, it is also fundamentally wrong to believe that these cities forever lost their entrepreneurial dynamic. And over the course of 2 years, research that I've been doing as part of my doctorate at the LSE, I've succeeded in generating a database looking at the trajectory of entrepreneurship in entrepreneurial activity in Thessaloniki and Izmir. And I'll stop calling them Smyrna and Salonika and start calling them Izmir and Thessaloniki from now on, because they are now called Izmir and Thessaloniki. So I look at entrepreneurial activity over time, and I identify remarkable levels of continuity in relative terms. And I promise you that this is the only graph I'm going to show you today. This is not meant to be an academic lecture by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's helpful to look at these graphs, which essentially chart the position of entrepreneurship in both cities relative to the averages of their respective nation states. So the first graph looks at Salonika in relation to Athens and the urban average of Greece. And you can see there in the bottom X side of the graph, you can see different data points, and these symbolize the industrial censuses, which look at the number of joint stock companies in a given city. And so you can tell from the number of joint stock companies divided by the working population what the firm concentration is in different cities. And looking at the early days, so it was 1927 is the first industrial census of modern Turkey, and 1920 the first industrial census of Greece. These cities have always been ahead of the Greek and Turkish average in terms of entrepreneurial activity, the number of joint stock companies as a percentage divided by the working age population. So they remain entrepreneurial, and this, ladies and gentlemen, is important because you can see that the trend plays out over the entire century. It's not a snapshot in time. You say, right, in 2020, they are more entrepreneurial, have more startups, let's say, or more joint stock companies than Athens or Istanbul, and that mirrors the earlier phase. It's something that plays out over the whole period. And certainly while the Alatinis, the Danons and the OCNs of this world had moved on, the cities still punch above their weight in terms of producing leading entrepreneurs. There are many modern examples. There's Hüsnü Özyeğin, who is one of Turkey's richest people and was, I think, the richest person in Turkey for several years in the 1990s and 2000s. He was the founder of Finansbank, which has recently been sold, very influential, born in Izmir and conducted much of his early business in Izmir. There's Yavuz Tatush, who is a very important financier from Izmir, who has done extremely well and is now a philanthropist and somebody banging the drum for the return to a cosmopolitan Izmir. And this here is Albert Burla, who is one of few remaining Jews in Thessaloniki. And I think it's safe to say that he does his community particularly proud because as the CEO of Pfizer International, he is responsible, has been the architect behind the production and distribution of the eponymous Pfizer vaccine. So a remnant of Ottoman Salonika having a positive effect on the world today. And despite their waning importance to international trade, there remains one standalone legacy of both cities' trading pasts. And this here is the site of the Thessaloniki International Trade Festival, which is the largest trade festival in Greece and the Balkans, a real mammoth of an event that takes place every year in September. It brings together around 500,000 people each year, and what it tries to do is showcase local Greek and international brands and to present a sort of outward-looking face for the Greek economy. And the fact that it was established in Thessaloniki in 1926 and not in Athens was because of the ingenuity and the creativity of its founder, the local political activist turned liberal MP, Stefanos Germanos, who successfully made the case that the most international city in Greece deserved to have the accolade of organizing an international trade festival, Greece's international trade festival. And he worked tirelessly to make it happen, sort of from the inside almost, working with Prime Minister Venizelos, himself also a liberal, to make sure that the festival was established in Thessaloniki and not in Athens. And he argued that Thessaloniki will always be an important city in the Balkans. It will always be an important city for Turkey. It has closer connections with Istanbul and with other cities in the Balkans than Athens does. And he made that case successfully. And it should also be stated, ladies and gentlemen, that this is not an event without local precedent. In fact, an annual trade festival has occurred on the same site as this, pretty much uninterrupted in time from the 11th century up until the arrival of the Greek army, and it's earned different names. As time and different communities call it different things. The Dimitreika, in reference to the patron saint of the city, Saint Demetrius is what the Greeks call it. The Yeni Kapan, in Turkish, the new market, that wasn't that new as we've just seen, and the Comercial, called by the Ladinos, by the Jews. And the festival seems to have been founded by a Byzantine governor of the Komnenos dynasty in the late 11th century, and has acted as the main, or had acted as the main Balkan trading emporium for the best part of a millennium. So very important element of continuity. And this here is the festival today. It's a fantastic event. If you're in Thessaloniki in early September is a fantastic time to go, by the way. You should definitely check out the International Trade Festival. And the two cities mirror each other in this respect as well. This here is the Izmir International Fair, which was established in 1930 ostensibly as a poster child of Turkey's Republic's commercial face. Today, the International Fair is the biggest annual business event in Turkey. It's one of the biggest in the Middle East, very important event. And if Salonika's event was a mammoth, as I said, this one is an absolute colossus. It has exposition space of over 80,000 square meters, and it brings together 2 million people over 4 days every year. And its exhibits showcase brands in a variety of different sectors, covering anything from agri-food and renewable energy to aerospace and robotics. So it's a forum for the discussion around innovative technologies and products as well. And like its equivalent in Thessaloniki, this institution is not new. On a smaller site, under today's modern exhibition center in the Kulturpark, lies the site of a former exposition space for silks and spices, which several centuries formed the principal Western showcase for silk route goods. It's sort of a bookend of the silk route on its tapering journey through Asia, Central Asia, and Iran. That is the facade of the main exposition space in Izmir today. This occurs later in September. So if you want to do a tour of the Levantine trade festivals, block off a September and visit Salonika in the early part, and then move on to Izmir in the later part. So citizens of Thessaloniki and Izmir continue to be very proud of their unique entrepreneurial character and their trading history, and they guard this uniqueness jealously. And as part of this, the trade festivals have acquired an almost cultish personality. Athens and Ankara know better than to rain on or intrude on Thessaloniki and Izmir's parade. And this is a headline from Macedonia newspaper, which is the main daily outlet in Thessaloniki, and it's an article written in 1957, and it lambasts Athenian politicians for daring to support an American-Greek consortium in attempting to set up a competitor international trade festival in Athens. And I'm going to quote directly from the article. The thriving commercial lady of the Thermaic Gulf, which is the gulf upon which Salonika sits, is put upon again by the fluid-filled apparatchiks of Athens. The jealous capital, as would an evil stepmother, wishes to loot the city of St. Demetrius. We must fight to stop these crimes against our city and save our beloved International Trade Festival, symbol of who we are and of our city's many triumphs. The article goes on. When will Athens learn, it says? As the entrepreneurial powerhouse of Hellenism, it is Thessaloniki's destiny to lead the Greek world in an industrial and commercial renaissance. History has ordained it. And in identity terms as well, Izmirlis, citizens of Izmir, also see themselves as fundamentally different to the rest of Turks. And a recent survey of local values has shown just how different they see themselves. Citizens of Izmir widely regard themselves today as the most Western, most modern, and of course, most entrepreneurial people in Turkey. And Izmir is perhaps the only major city in Turkey to resist this turn to Islamism seen in other parts of the country. It's never returned an AK Party mayor, which I think is important. Of course, Istanbul has. And their antipathy towards the government is entirely mutual. The city is often derided as Gavur Izmir, meaning literally the infidel Izmir, and it's a trope that was first leveled by Sultan Abdul Hamid in the 1870s, ostensibly to castigate the indecencies of the late Ottoman Porte, but it is embraced wholeheartedly by President Erdogan today. And this is a really fun slide. This is also taken, funnily enough, from the trade fair, the Izmir International Trade Fair. It says, Biz Gavur Izmirliyiz, and then further down, Laikliin Halesiyiz. So we are the infidels of Izmir, we are the bastions of secularism. And so you can see here that the trade festivals are used as kind of arenas to assert local identity against the capital city, against the government. And in the spirit of this kind of difference, you can see a host of colourful political personalities that emerge routinely in Thessaloniki and Izmir. And there's sort of personalities that always use history as a means of generating political capital or making points. And I think it's very interesting to note that in keeping with the entrepreneurialism of the city's pasts, mayors themselves tend to be entrepreneurs. And in Thessaloniki, 21 out of 39 mayors since 1922 have been entrepreneurs. In Smyrna, the figure is 18 out of 30. And you compare this to Athens and Istanbul, it's quite interesting. 4 out of 40 in Athens have been entrepreneurs, and even smaller proportion in Istanbul and Ankara. And this seems to suggest some kind of social legitimacy ascribed to entrepreneurship, in the sense that entrepreneurs are seen as public figures, and entrepreneurs themselves view their achievements as something worth showcasing. So this here is the mayor, Yanis Boutaris, who was mayor of Thessaloniki for several years between 2009 and 2019. He was a real advocate for reacquainting citizens of Thessaloniki with the entrepreneurial and cosmopolitan, most importantly, cosmopolitan past. And he organized several initiatives that was designed to sort of remind citizens of this past. The most famous of these, some may have been aware of this particular event, was a major commemoration in 2012 of the 100 years since the conquest of the city by the Greek army. And while certain mayors, nationalist mayors certainly, would have used the occasion as an opportunity to wave the flag and sing the anthem and reenact war scenes, and I believe you me, there are certain mayors in Greece who have done this in the past. What did Boutaris do? He invited dignitaries from around the world, members of the former communities, ethnic communities, religious communities of Ottoman Salonika, to share in the city's celebrations. And a lot of these celebrations centered around the new spanking Jewish museum of the city. And this gentleman here being selfied is Aziz Pojaolu. He was a ceramics and furniture entrepreneur turned politician, and was mayor of Izmir for an even longer time, Boutaris, from 2004 to 2019. He's been a great advocate for regenerating Izmir's past, and particularly its transport links. And very importantly, he spearheaded an initiative to open the former transport link par excellence of Izmir with Salonika, and he helped set up a direct line, Turkish Airlines line flight, the first direct flight between Salonika and Smyrna. And if you want to travel from Salonika and from Thessaloniki to Izmir, on the Turkish Airlines website, it takes 45 minutes, it's very quick, and you can relive the experience, at least from above, of the merchants of old. And he also set out, although he hasn't succeeded in doing this yet, to create the first maritime link in some time between Izmir and its former provisioning island and emporium of Chios. And it's an initiative that I was involved in when I was doing my gap year in Chios in 2014. And so what I try to demonstrate with these examples is that while Salonika and Smyrna were brutally affected by the events of 1912 to 1922, significant features of their pasts live on, both in physical form, but also in the hearts and minds of their inhabitants. The cities may have lost their cosmopolitan character, they have retained their entrepreneurialism. They are no longer centers of international trade, but trade forms a very sensitive part of their identity. And they continue to experience that unique unease in the relationship with the government and the capital city, reminiscent of Ottoman times, struggling as they do to reconcile both the memory of and aspiration for this swashbuckling global role within the centralizing orthodoxies of the Greek and Turkish nation state. So what future for these two formerly great cities? And in many ways, though the tides of history have buffeted Thessaloniki and Izmir against the proverbial rocks, the two retain in their citizens the quintessence of old Salonika and Smyrna. And in this sense, at least, they remain cities of unique potential in Greece, Turkey, the Balkans, and Eastern Mediterranean. I think that with a correct management and a good dose of public investment, and with a recognition by the capital cities of their unique potential as furnaces of creativity and of wealth creation and innovation, they may yet re-emerge as important regional players. But as ever, it will be the politics of Greece, Turkey, and the wider region that determine this. Nationalism, borders, and ideologies sometimes work for states, but they're no good for cities, as this particular case has shown us. But unlike states and borders, neither of which last forever, cities have that rather important knack of being able to survive. And as such, it's to they whom we must look as the surest vessels for the progress of civilization, both in the Aegean near east and further afield. Thank you.
I'm just going to change the...
Thank you very much, Michael, for that wonderful talk. A very new perspective, and nobody knows it better than you, who come from that region to a certain extent and also embody the values of the Levant in London. And I'm sure more about Chios and what is happening there and other Greek islands nearby and between Salonika and Smyrna. Now, I'm sure there are lots of questions. Who has any questions? I might begin by talking about the eccentric family. I know a member, and he refused to be quoted. He's a Londoner himself. He refused to be quoted about these doubts and reservations and criticisms of Ataturk, which lasted into throughout the 20th century. And we look forward one day to the publication of Latifa Hammond's memoirs. Though it's interesting that she did choose to live in Istanbul, not in Izmir, as it's become. Any questions? Yes.
Yeah, I had a question about the Alatinis in Salonika. You mentioned their textiles. As far as I understand, the mill that you showed was a flour mill, largest in Macedonia, I believe. Yes. And they had beer factories and various other investments. So can you enlighten me a bit about the textiles?
Yes, well, they were heavily diversified. That factory was built much later, and that's a sort of late 19th century factory. The Alatinis got rich on textiles much earlier. So they used their sort of capital they generated from the textile trade to diversify into things like flour and biscuits. They made some really great biscuits, which I think still exist. There are Alatini biscuits in Greece today. So they were a phenomenally successful entrepreneurial unit, and they were a clan more than just a family. There were many Alatini families. It wasn't just one. Sort of like the Byzantines, who had sort of clans rather than families. So yeah, I mean, the textiles was their start, and they rapidly moved on into an array of different economic activities.
And talking of food, you can get in London at Gale's Bakeries something called berraquitas,
yes,
which I think is a Spanish Jewish from Salonika for Berek.
Yes,
the Spanish Jewish take on Berek.
Yes, it's fascinating. Yeah.
More questions?
Yes, we have a question on the chat. Sorry.
Yes,
brilliant.
We have one here. What was the lingua franca between the Turkish-speaking Greek traders established in Smyrna and their Greek counterparts in other parts of the world?
Right, so let's pick the bones out of that. So the Turkish traders in Izmir with the Greeks abroad. Was that the question?
Yes, the Turkish-speaking Greek traders and their Greek counterparts in other parts of the world. So what language how did they speak?
Well, I think it would have varied. I mean, also at different stage in history, they would have probably spoken different languages. So eventually it would have been French, but I think earlier it could have even been Pidgin Italian, which was actually what lingua franca meant. Lingua franca was a term used to describe the Italian that was used in the Levant as a kind of common language, as a common means of dialogue. So I think we're talking, look, the Greeks were dominating Smyrna's trade by the 19th century, and lingua franca was about to be used by the 19th century. So I think French is probably the most probably the best answer, but I think it would have varied. I think many Turks did speak Greek and would have used Greek. Many more Turks in Smyrna spoke Greek than the other way around. Greeks didn't usually speak Turkish in Smyrna.
But Onassis, who was from Smyrna,
yes,
exported himself rapidly after 1923 to Argentina. So perhaps he spoke Spanish. Another.
I can't say I know.
There's a question over here.
Yes, your graph of Thessaloniki indicated a downturn about 20 years ago. And I wonder why that was, and did it continue after 2018 with the graph stopped?
It's the euro problem.
So the downturn is a kind of national one. It's the debt crisis. I probably should explain that better. So you see that the Izmir graph, Turkish graph, seems to go up and up, as you'd expect. But the Greek one sees a sort of general downturn. Urban Greece, Athens and Thessaloniki all see a reduction in entrepreneurship around the time of the debt crisis. So from 2009 onwards. But the real downturn, I didn't mention this in the lecture, but I think I should just say it now. There was a downturn after the decosmopolitanization of Salonika. So if you look at entrepreneurship in the 1940s and 50s, and we're missing, sadly, the 1940 industrial census, hence why you saw that gaping gap in the middle at the start. Sadly, we're missing that census because it was lost in a fire and never replaced. The glories of the Greek National Statistical Authority in evidence. But the loss of the Jews in particular was extremely significantly felt in Salonika in terms of entrepreneurship. A third of the city's businesses were literally struck off during the Holocaust. The Nazis forbade Jews to have businesses. And I think part of the story is that the loss of the Jewish business meant that per capita joint stock companies were less as a proportion of the population, which didn't change that much because by that time the Greeks were around 250,000 and the Jews only 65,000 in Salonika.
We have more questions on the chat.
Okay.
Did British consuls in 18th century Smyrna, of whom an ancestor of mine was one, and British merchants in general, play any significant role in generating sympathy for Hellenism and the cause of Greek independence in the early 19th century?
Well, I think the simple answer to that question is yes. In the early 19th century. I think, look, the answer to the question is possibly more nuanced. So if you think about the early period of the War of Independence, a lot of Levantines in particular did not want anything to change. They were very keen that the world continued just as it was, just as Turkish and Greek merchants in 1922 were very keen that things did not change. But of course, British merchants and I would say Britons in general, being pragmatic people, understood where things were going during the revolution, and then were likely by the end of the revolution to be more amenable to the idea of Greek independence. Whether there are any initiatives of Brits sponsoring Greek schools or Hellenic activities or Hellenistic activities in any way, I'm not an expert on that particular subject, so I'd be telling a lie if I said anything. But the position of Brits is certainly an interesting one. I hope I do justice to the participant.
We have another one.
Yes, okay.
Do you assign specific responsibility for the horrific massacre of the Greek population of Smyrna in 1922?
Do I assign specific responsibility?
Yes.
Well, you've actually thrown me under a bus there. It's a very difficult question to answer. Look, the events of 1922 and 1923 were brutal events. They were events following a very, very bloody war over a period of 1919 to 22, following the First World War. Who do I say was responsible? Well, there are different levels of responsibility. I think it's a very nuanced answer. You could say the Greeks were responsible for invading Western Anatolia to begin with, and then you could say more directly that the Turkish authorities were responsible for pushing the population exchange. The exact numbers of people who died during this period are unknown. It's still extremely difficult to say. Clearly, many of them did die, and there were atrocities committed. There's no question about that. You know, we hold those who committed the atrocities responsible for the atrocities. And, you know, there were young Turkish elements, there were Chetes who were involved, there were elements of the resistance under Kemal that were involved as well. But you should also remember the other side of the story, which is that these people did feel that their country was being invaded. And we were living back then with extremely different times. And you have to always consider these things in their historical context.
If I may add something, Sir Harry Lamb, the British consul in Izmir, blamed Turkish forces, and of course Mustafa Kemal was in command of Izmir at the time of the fire, so he bears ultimate responsibility for events taking place in the city under his command.
Right, we have another question as well.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the incident at Ataturk's museum in 1955?
We'll have to remind you what the incident is. Possibly jump to the next question and then...
I think that's
I don't think I can answer that one.
So I don't know if that...
I'd love to know what the incident was.
Yes. Well, we could
manufactured attack.
Yeah, we could give an excuse
for anti-Greek attacks.
Maybe I'll ask something. So with the sort of change in populations within the cities, the change of identities, what was the secret sauce that actually enabled entrepreneurs to continue?
Yes, I mean, that's a very interesting question. The answer is complicated, but what I'd say about it is that in large part, Greek state builders tapped in to something that already existed in Salonika and essentially ornamented it with the bells and whistles of Hellenism. And so the story of entrepreneurialism was retold as a Greek story. Salonican story of entrepreneurialism was retold. And basically, what state builders, in conjunction with the nationalist business people, created as a kind of imaginary was that the city had always been entrepreneurial. It had always been Greek, and it's the Hellenism of the city that informed its entrepreneurialism. And it's also important to remember at this time that Greece imagined itself in its totality as a commercial state, a commercial country, a commercial people. And the Greeks were very commercial people, and the diaspora shows that. The state, of course, there was a sort of capabilities, expectations. They assumed that they had to create a very entrepreneurial state, but because the state was so weak, they were unable to do so. But they kind of imagined themselves as entrepreneurial in the first phase of the 20th century. And so the idea of entrepreneurialism is quite consistent with notions of Hellenism at the time. So that transition was easier. Of course, cosmopolitanism and Hellenism are totally diametrically opposed. And so that those two could not be assimilated when the Greek forces conquered the city and was assimilated into Greece.
We have no more questions on the chat, and I think Giacomo has left. So we don't know the answer to the incident in 1955.
Right, and I apologise. I should really know about that.
It was alleged by Turkish sources, and it triggered off the crowd attacks in Istanbul and Izmir on minorities in 1955. I don't think it ever happened, the attack on Ataturk's birthplace in Salonika. Anyway, thank you so much for a wonderful talk, which I'm sure will lead to other events in
Thank you very much.
in other places. And of course, we all have to prepare for the commemoration of 2022 next year.
Absolutely, yes. Wow, that's going to be quite something, won't it?
The great soul searching in Izmir and of course in Greece too.
I wonder if the mayor will do anything similar to Cottakis in 2012. The new mayor, not Kojal anymore, the new one.
What's he called, the new mayor?
Cullinan, I think is his name. But he's of a different political persuasion. He's not. So I think it's the MHP party, not the CHP party. And so he's got a slightly different outlook on questions of cosmopolitanism in particular.
Thank you very much indeed, and now we can continue our discussion. Thank you. Thank you.